So far, we have talked about encoding meaning in individual words. Now, let's talk about some aspects of meaning as it pertains to utterances and sentences. The concepts we're going to cover in this lecture are a proposition, an entailment, and a presupposition. We will define each term and provide examples, and learn to distinguish between entailments and presuppositions. Let's start with propositions. A proposition is a core meaning of an utterance or a sentence, regardless of its form. Let's consider this sentence: Jacinda grows daffodils. And this one: daffodils are grown by Jacinda. The first one of these is in active voice, with the grower, Jacinda, occupying the subject position. The second one is in the passive voice, with the product occupying the subject position. But from the point of view of semantics, Jacinda is the grower in both sentences. Growing is the action performed by Jacinda in both sentences, and daffodils are the product of Jacinda's action in both sentences. These sentences, despite their different grammatical forms, express the same proposition. Another feature of propositions is that they express truth value. They can be either true or false. That Jacinda grows daffodils is either true or false, depending on the state of affairs in the world. But not all utterances express propositions. An utterance like, "What time is it?" does not express a proposition because it is neither true nor false. It's a question. When it comes to the truth value of propositions, we distinguish between two types, analytic and synthetic. Analytic propositions are true or false by virtue of the words used in them. For example, dentists are medical professionals is true because the definition of a dentist is a doctor qualified to treat diseases and illnesses related to one's teeth and gums, and doctors are medical professionals. The proposition, pears grow on trees, is also true because of the nature of pears. They are fruit borne by a pear tree. The proposition, water is dry, is false because by definition water is a liquid, so it is wet. Synthetic propositions are either true or false based on the state of affairs in the world. If we return to Jacinda growing daffodils, we don't know whether this proposition is true or false, unless we know a person named Jacinda and we know about her gardening practices. The propositions like pears grow on tall trees and this water is cold are also synthetic. In the proposition, the statement about pears, tall is a subjective evaluative term. What is tall for one person or a tree is not tall for another. Pear trees tend to be about 20 feet tall, and that's pretty tall. But redwood trees can be 350 feet, so they're considerably taller. The proposition, this water is cold, is synthetic from multiple perspectives. First, cold, as tall, is a subjective evaluative term. Second, what counts as cold depends on what temperature of the water is needed for specific purposes. Water at 80 degrees Fahrenheit is not cold for swimming in, but it's too cold for cooking. Thus, the truth of these propositions depends not on the logical meaning of the words used in them, but on the state of affairs in the world and, to a degree, on the purposes of communication. Entailment is another semantic notion that is related to the concept of a proposition. An entailment is a relationship between two propositions where if proposition A is true, proposition B must also be true as a logical conclusion. This is a bit of a mouthful, so let's look at an example. If we say, Jacinda grows daffodils, and it is a true fact about the world, then it must also necessarily be true that Jacinda grows flowers, because daffodils are flowers. Entailment is a one-way relationship. For example, if it is true that Jacinda grows flowers, it is not necessarily true that she grows daffodils. She may be growing roses or irises instead. Entailment is an important aspect of meaning We don't go around spelling out every single thing in the world. We draw logical conclusions from what is said. That is why an interaction such as the one you see on your screen is not something we are likely to engage in. It would be considered very odd. So, if a student asks me, "Professor, did I pass the class?" and I say, "You got an A," it would be very strange for the student to say, "Okay, but did I pass the class?" The logic and conclusion of the proposition "you got an A" is you passed the class. It does not need to be spelled out. Entailments need to be particularly considered when legal documents such as contracts are drafted. Now let's talk about presuppositions. A presupposition is also a relationship between two propositions, but it goes in the opposite direction of an entailment. If we have a proposition A and it is true, the proposition B needs to be true first. Again, let's look at an example. For the statement, Jacinta grows daffodils to be true, it first needs to be true that Jacinta actually exists. If Jacinta does not exist, then she cannot grow daffodils. Presuppositions are also important because when we communicate, we also state things that assume other things to be true. Let's look at a specific example of presuppositions as they're displayed in loaded questions. Imagine yourself being accused of cheating and taken to the Office of Student Conduct and Integrity. A person investigating the accusation asks you, "Have you stopped cheating on exams?" Answer yes or no. You would probably get offended immediately, especially if you have never cheated. The presupposition in this question is you have previously cheated on exams. You cannot simply answer yes to this question, because this would mean admitting that you cheated before. You cannot answer no either, because that would mean stating that you are still cheating. This question is loaded. This example of a loaded question is pretty blatant, and in real life, even if instructed to answer only yes or no, you're not likely to abide by that instruction in order to defend yourself. But in legal discourse, especially in witness and suspect interrogations, loaded questions can be quite complex and convoluted. One form of them is leading questions, and there are legal regulations on whom an attorney can and cannot ask such questions in the courtroom. So, let's briefly discuss why we are even talking about entailments and presuppositions with regard to meaning. I already mentioned that when we talk, we do not spell out every single little thing. But when we say something, we invoke a myriad of assumptions about how the world and the language work. Both entailments and presuppositions rest on these assumptions. The use of particular words automatically leads to both the speaker and the recipient to bring these assumptions into understanding what is being said. Let's consider these statements. Muriel has fed her cat. The presupposition here is that Muriel has a cat. If it is not true that she has a cat, it can't possibly be true that she has fed it. The entailment is that Muriel's cat has eaten. Let's look at another statement. Brian and Zena broke up. What is the presupposition here? Pause for a second and jot it down. If you're studying with a partner, you may want to compare the results. And what is the entailment? Again, pause for a second and jot it down. While your assumptions may be slightly different than those of another person's, they are most likely to fall into particular categories. The presupposition is that Brian and Zena used to be a couple, and the entailment is that they are no longer coupled with one another. Let's recap. Declarative statements express propositions which are core meanings regardless of the form of the statement. Propositions can be either true or false. If they're true or false, by dint of the words used in them, we consider them analytically true or false. If to determine their truth or falsehood, we need to know the state of affairs in the world, they're synthetically true or false. Entailments are logical conclusions from propositions. And presuppositions are logical preconditions, prerequisites for the truth of propositions. We will revisit these concepts and explore how they function in communication in more detail when we talk about pragmatics.